At approximately 2:56 in the morning, on November 21, 1944, in the cold black water of the Formosa Strait, Commander Eli T. Reich stood inside the control room of USS Celian while the Japanese battleship Congo moved somewhere ahead of him in the dark. Verify exact time and firing sequence before recording. There was no grand music in that room. No flags snapping in the wind. No heroic sunlight over the Pacific. There was only steel. Steel walls. Steel pipes. Steel torpedoes. Steel pressure in the lungs of every man trying not to breathe too loudly. The submarine smelled of oil, sweat, battery fumes, stale clothes, and warm metal. Somewhere forward, torpedo men waited beside long, sleeping cylinders filled with explosive power. In the control room, men leaned over gauges and plotting tables. The boat moved beneath the surface with the patience of an animal that could not afford to be seen. Above them, the Japanese force was moving through waters that still seemed, at least on paper, to belong to the Empire. Congo was not a merchant ship. She was not a slow freighter or a helpless tanker. She was a battleship, old, proud, heavily armed, a symbol of naval power from an earlier age of war. And yet, in that moment, she was vulnerable to something smaller, colder, and almost invisible. The American submarine was not built to impress crowds. It did not dominate a harbor skyline. It did not carry the psychological weight of a battleship. This power came from absence, from waiting, from the discipline of not being seen until it was too late. Through the darkness, Reich's crew worked the problem: range, speed, angle, target course. The mathematics had to become instinct. A few degrees wrong, and the torpedo would pass behind the target. A few seconds too late, and the enemy would turn. A noise at the wrong moment, a bad trim, a careless movement, and the submarine could become the hunted. The order came: torpedoes away. For the men inside Celian, the seconds after firing were always strange. The violence had already been released, but the result had not yet returned. In those seconds, a man could hear everything. The soft throb of machinery, the clipped voices, the faint shifting of bodies in a confined space, the ocean pressing against the hull. Then came the explosion, not close enough to tear them apart, not distant enough to ignore. A deep, heavy sound, carried through water and steel. Above them, Japanese sailors were thrown into a reality no newspaper headline could soften. A battleship had been struck not by carrier aircraft in daylight, not by a fleet action visible across the horizon, but by a submerged enemy that had arrived like a rumor and attacked like a calculation. This was the kind of fear Japan did not want printed plainly. The Japanese public could be told of sacrifice. They could be told of heroic resistance, imperial destiny, and enemy losses. They could be given language designed to preserve morale when food grew scarce and air raids came closer. But the men at sea knew another truth. A ship could vanish between one report and the next. A convoy could leave port and never arrive. A tanker could become fire on black water. A destroyer could search, circle, drop depth charges, listen, and still find nothing. The American submarine war was not spectacular in the way newspapers preferred. It did not always offer clean images of victory. Much of it happened under the surface, beyond witnesses, in weather and darkness. It was a war of pressure, of absence, of tonnage removed from schedules, of fuel that never reached airfields, of men waiting on islands for supplies that were already on the ocean floor. Japan believed the war could still be framed through courage, obedience, and controlled information. But beneath the Pacific, another story was being written. Not in ink, in missing ships. And before the Japanese home front fully understood what was happening, the men responsible for moving Japan's oil, food, soldiers, and ammunition had already begun to fear the empty space on the sea where a ship should have been. The question was no longer whether American submarines could kill. The question was how long Japan could keep pretending those losses were not cutting into the bones of the empire. In Tokyo, the war did not arrive first as fire or hunger. It arrived as paper, morning editions, official statements, carefully shaped language, reports that spoke of determination, enemy damage, heroic resistance, and temporary hardship. The newspaper was not only a source of information. It was a wall, thin, printed, fragile, standing between ordinary people and the full weight of a war moving against them. A man on a streetcar could unfold the paper and read about courage in the South Pacific. A mother could scan the columns for some indication that the sacrifices were still leading somewhere. A factory worker could read about production goals, patriotic duty, the enemy's weakness, the need for endurance. What most of them could not read was the true arithmetic of the sea. They could not see every tanker lost. They could not see cargo manifests erased by torpedoes. They could not see how many ships left Singapore, Manila, Truk, or the Dutch East Indies and failed to reach Japan. They could not see naval officers studying convoy routes with increasing unease, or shipping officials realizing that numbers on paper no longer matched the physical world. Wartime governments rarely tell the full truth while the war is still being fought. Japan was not unique in censorship, secrecy, or morale management. But Japan's problem was especially cruel because the empire depended on distance. It had stretched itself across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. It had captured resources far from the home islands. And every gain created a new line that had to be defended, supplied, and connected. The public language remained firm because it had to be firm. It had to make retreat sound temporary. It had to make shortage sound honorable. It had to make loss sound purposeful. It had to prevent fear from becoming accusation. But steel ships did not obey slogans. A newspaper could describe spiritual strength, could not replace a tanker, could announce that sacrifice was necessary, could not deliver oil to a pilot training field. It could avoid saying that American submarines had become a deepening threat. It could not put rice back onto a freighter already broken below the waves. Inside government offices and naval bureaus, the tone was different. Reports were not written for public comfort. They carried numbers, routes, tonnage, escort requirements, schedules, loss estimates. A merchant ship was not a symbol there. It was capacity. It was fuel, engines, hull plates, crew, cargo, time. And time was becoming the most expensive material of all. Japan's leaders understood that morale mattered. They had seen how a nation at war could survive hardship if the people believed the hardship had meaning. But belief becomes dangerous when it begins to replace measurement. If the official story says the empire is enduring, while the shipping tables say the empire is bleeding, someone must eventually choose which reality to obey. In the early years, Japanese confidence had reasons behind it. The empire had struck hard. It had seized territory. It had humiliated Western powers that many Japanese leaders believed were soft, divided, and slow. The Navy had prestige. The Army had momentum. The public had been trained to see sacrifice as duty. But by 1943 and 1944, another pattern was forming, one that did not fit easily into official language. Ships were leaving and not returning. Convoys were requiring more escorts. Routes were being changed. Delays were becoming common. Cargoes were arriving late, damaged, reduced, or not at all. No single lost ship broke the empire. That was the deceptive thing. A torpedo sinking one freighter could be dismissed as a loss of war. Another could be absorbed. A third could be hidden. But the campaign did not depend on one dramatic moment. It depended on repetition, on the quiet multiplication of absence. The fear of submarines moved first among those who had to sail. Merchant crews felt it in their stomachs before civilians saw it in ration lines. Escort commanders felt it when they stared over dark water and knew they were protecting too much with too little. Harbor officials felt it when expected arrivals did not come. Pilots felt it later, when fuel became too precious to waste on training. Soldiers felt it on islands where supplies were reduced, then delayed, then impossible. The newspapers could still speak. But the ocean had begun answering in a different language. And that language was harder to censor. Because when a ship did not arrive, no editor could make its cargo appear at the dock. An empire balanced on ships. Japan's empire was not only a map. It was a chain. Oil from the south. Rubber from captured territories. Food from distant regions. Bauxite, tin, coal, machinery, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, aviation gasoline. Every item had to move. Every movement required hulls, engines, crews, escorts, fuel, weather, timing, and luck. In a classroom or staff briefing, the map could look clean. Arrows from resource areas to the home islands. Lines across the Pacific. Ports marked with confident names. Naval bases, anchorages, staging points, island garrisons. The empire looked connected because ink connected it. But water is not ink. A line drawn across an ocean does not move a cargo ship. It does not protect a tanker in darkness. It does not stop a submarine commander from watching smoke on the horizon through a periscope. It does not calm a merchant sailor when the escort suddenly turns hard and begins dropping depth charges. Japan's early expansion gave it what it needed and made those needs harder to satisfy. The farther the empire reached, the more shipping it required. The more shipping it required, the more exposed it became. The very success of expansion created the conditions for strangulation. This was the hidden problem beneath the official confidence. Japan had built a war machine that demanded movement across sea lanes. But it had not built enough margin for losing those sea lanes. It had powerful warships, skilled officers, brave sailors, and a naval tradition that prized decisive combat. Yet merchant shipping, the unglamorous bloodstream of the empire, did not receive the same attention as the great fleet units. A battleship could inspire. A carrier could change a battle. A cruiser could be photographed, named, remembered. A cargo ship simply had to arrive. And that made it easy to underestimate until it was gone. American submarines attacked that weakness directly. They did not need to occupy islands to make islands starve. They did not need to defeat every surface ship to make convoys hesitate. They did not need to destroy Japan in one blow. They only had to make the empire pay a toll every time it tried to breathe. In the Dutch East Indies, oil mattered because Japan could not fight a modern war on courage alone. Aircraft needed fuel. Ships needed fuel. Trucks needed fuel. Training required fuel. Even the act of defending the fuel required fuel. A tanker moving north was not just a ship. It was future flight hours. It was escort range. It was the possibility of movement. When that tanker burned, more than a hull disappeared. Options disappeared. This is where the war beneath the Pacific became different from the war in headlines. Newspapers prefer events. A battle. A victory. A heroic death. A named island. A dramatic charge. Logistics does not always offer that shape. It is slower and more merciless. It changes what commanders can attempt before they ever issue an order. A Japanese staff officer might still draw arrows on a map. But by late war, the arrows had to pass through danger zones increasingly shaped by American submarines. A plan that required fuel became uncertain. A garrison that required reinforcement became isolated. A pilot who needed training hours received fewer of them. A factory that needed raw material waited longer. The empire did not collapse all at once. It narrowed. That is harder to see in the moment. A civilian does not wake up one morning and know that maritime logistics has entered a fatal decline. He sees less food. He hears more official appeals. He watches young men leave. He notices shortages explained as sacrifice. He may not connect the missing rice or fuel to a submarine that fired torpedoes weeks earlier, hundreds of miles away. But the connection was there. Under the water. Under the language. Under the slogans. The Japanese believed territory meant strength. They believed captured resources could feed the war. They believed the empire's reach could become permanent if the people endured and the navy held the line. What they did not fully admit was that every distant possession became a demand placed on shipping. Every demand created movement. Every movement created exposure. And in that exposure, American submarines found the softest part of the empire. Not the armor, the arteries, the men inside the steel tube. The American submariners did not begin the war as legends. They began it as men inside narrow steel boats, surrounded by machinery that could save them or kill them depending on whether it kept working under pressure. A submarine at sea was a world of discomfort made normal by repetition. Bunks were hot and close. Clothes stayed damp. Diesel fumes settled into skin. Food lost its freshness. The air could become thick and sour after long hours submerged. Men learned the sounds of their boat the way a person learns the breathing of someone sleeping beside them. A pump sounded different when strained. A valve had its own small complaint. A loose object falling during a depth charge attack could feel like betrayal. They lived with the knowledge that escape was mostly a comforting word. On a surface ship, a man could imagine abandoning ship. In an aircraft, a pilot could imagine a parachute. In a submarine deep under enemy waters, imagination had less room. If the hull failed, if flooding could not be stopped, if depth charges found the right distance, the ocean did not negotiate. And still they went out. Partly because they were trained to, partly because they believed in the mission, partly because every war asks ordinary people to accept situations that would be unthinkable in peace. But the early submarine war gave them another enemy: their own torpedoes. The Mark 14 torpedo was supposed to be a decisive weapon. It was expensive, complex, and trusted by the system that issued it. But submariners began seeing something that contradicted official confidence. Torpedoes ran too deep. Exploders failed. Perfect shots produced no explosion. Commanders risked their boats, lined up attacks, fired, waited, and heard nothing. Imagine that kind of silence. Not peaceful silence. Not empty silence. The silence after you have exposed your position and given the enemy a reason to hunt you. Inside the submarine, men would wait for the sound of impact. They knew the timing. They knew roughly when the hit should come. The seconds stretched. A crew could almost feel the torpedo running through the water, carrying their hopes and their survival with it. Then nothing. No detonation. No broken ship. Only the knowledge that the target might still be alive, and the escorts might now be turning toward them. This was not an abstract technical flaw. It was personal. A faulty weapon meant a longer war patrol. It meant a more dangerous second attack. It meant a commander might begin to doubt his own firing solution. It meant good men could die because a weapon bureau refused too long to accept what crews were reporting from combat. The men in Washington had diagrams. The men in the submarine had silence. That gap mattered. It is easy later to speak of the American submarine campaign as if success were inevitable. It was not. The boats had to adapt. Commanders had to push. Crews had to keep believing in a mission while distrusting the tool meant to accomplish it. Mechanics, torpedo men, officers, and enlisted men all became part of a brutal learning process carried out under enemy depth charges. They were underdogs in a strange sense. Not because their nation lacked industrial power, but because the particular fight they were in was hidden, dangerous, and often misunderstood. Their victories could not always be seen. Their failures could be swallowed by the sea. Their complaints about torpedoes were, for a time, easier to dismiss than to admit. But combat has a way of punishing denial. A torpedo either explodes or it does not. A ship either sinks or it reaches port. A submarine either returns or becomes a name on a list. The American submariners had to solve their own hidden problem before they could become Japan's hidden fear. They had to turn cramped boats, flawed weapons, imperfect intelligence, and human exhaustion into a campaign capable of changing the war. And once the torpedoes began to work, Japan's sea lanes would begin to look very different. The unglamorous target. There is a reason people remember battleships. They look like power, long guns, towering superstructures, crews in formation, flags, armor, names that sound heavy even decades later. A battleship gives the eye something to understand. It looks like a nation made of steel. A cargo ship does not. A tanker is not romantic. A freighter loaded with rice, or rubber, or machine parts does not inspire the same awe. It moves slowly. It smokes. It rolls in bad weather. This crew works without ceremony. It carries the war rather than appearing to fight it. That is why cargo became such a deadly target. American submarines learned that sinking Japan's merchant fleet could do what dramatic fleet engagements could not always do. Could attack the future. A warship sunk was a visible blow. A tanker sunk was a spreading consequence. It did not only burn in the moment. It burned in every aircraft that could not train, every convoy that could not sail, every plan reduced by fuel calculations. Japan's public story needed visible courage. The submarine war attacked invisible dependents. This was the uncomfortable logic of the campaign. It was not always satisfying in the heroic sense. There were no crowds watching, no battlefield banners, no speeches before the shot. Often there was only a periscope view of a merchant ship, a firing solution, and then men waiting in a submerged boat for the sound of destruction. To the submariner, the target might be a silhouette. To Japan, that silhouette might be weeks of oil. The decision to wage unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan after Pearl Harbor marked a hard turn in the Pacific. The United States had seen what maritime strangulation could mean. It understood that Japan's empire had to move across water to live. The submarine force became the knife placed against that movement. But inside the boats, strategic theory reduced itself to small actions. A torpedo man checked mechanisms with tired hands. A cook secured loose gear before diving. A sonar operator strained to separate escort screws from merchant propellers. A commander weighed whether to fire now or creep closer. Closer meant better odds. Closer also meant less room to survive. For Japanese crews, the fear was different but just as human. A merchant sailor might spend hours looking at water that seemed empty. The ship's engines thumped below. The deck vibrated underfoot. Men smoked when allowed, checked lines, watched the escort, scanned for wakes that might already be too close by the time they were seen. The ocean could appear calm and still be full of threat. That is one of the cruelties of submarine warfare. Danger does not always announce itself. No massed artillery. No aircraft engine growing louder overhead. Sometimes the first sign is the impact itself. A column of water, a tearing sound, a deck lifting under the feet, lights going out, oil spreading, men shouting in the dark. The Japanese believed that discipline and courage could carry ships through danger. In many cases, crews did show discipline and courage. Merchant sailors returned to sea even when they knew the routes were dangerous. Escort crews hunted submarines with limited tools and too many miles to cover. But courage could not change the geometry of the problem. Japan had too much ocean, too many routes, too many cargoes, and too few ways to make every passage safe. American submarines did not have to be everywhere. They only had to be in enough places often enough to make the system fail. That is what made the campaign frightening. A single submarine was survivable as a threat. Patrol area could be avoided. Convoy could be rerouted. But a pattern is different. When ships disappear in multiple waters, when arrivals become uncertain, when every route has risk, fear stops being an event and becomes an atmosphere. It enters planning rooms. It enters harbors. It enters the mind of a captain before departure. And once fear becomes part of the schedule, the war has already changed. Japan's newspapers could describe submarines as enemy raiders, cowardly attackers, or manageable dangers. But men at sea knew better. They knew that an empire does not need to lose every ship to begin dying. It only needs to lose enough that every remaining ship becomes too precious, too late, and too exposed. Seconds after firing, the attack began long before the torpedo left the tube. It began with a sound contact, or a smear of smoke on the horizon, or a coded intelligence clue passed through channels the crew might never fully understand. It began when a submarine commander changed course and brought his boat toward danger. Inside the submarine, movement became quieter. Men who had joked earlier now spoke in short phrases. A hatch closed with care. Someone secured a mug. Someone checked a valve twice. The boat descended toward periscope depth, and the Pacific narrowed into instruments. Depth, bearing, range, target angle, speed. Numbers, 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 but never just numbers. Each one carried death inside it if wrong. The commander lifted the periscope only briefly. Too long, and an alert lookout might see the feather of water. Too short, and the target picture remained incomplete. Through the lens, the world became a thin circle of gray sea and distant hulls. A convoy might appear orderly from above, but through a periscope it was a puzzle moving across a hostile surface. The Japanese escorts were not decorations. They were listening, watching, waiting for the slightest sign. A wake, a shadow, a report from another ship, an explosion that revealed where the enemy might be. The submarine had to fire and vanish. In the torpedo room, the men had already done their work. Heavy fish loaded. Tubes ready. Gyros set. Doors prepared. No one needed a speech. The boat itself seemed to hold its breath. Fire 1. A compressed sound. A shudder. Fire 2. Another. Fire 3. The torpedoes left the submarine and entered the dark as if they had their own will. Then came waiting. The waiting was always the worst part because it belonged to no one. The crew could do nothing to improve the shot. The torpedo was gone. The solution was committed. The enemy still moved. Time, for a few seconds, became almost physical. Some men counted. Some stared. Some listened. A hit could arrive as a deep concussion through the hull. A miss could arrive as nothing at all. A premature explosion could confuse everyone. A dud could leave the target alive and the submarine in danger. Even success could become dangerous if escorts reacted quickly. Then the explosion came. On the surface, a Japanese ship lurched under impact. Men were thrown from bunks, ladders, watch positions. Steam lines ruptured. Cargo shifted. Lights failed. A hole opened where there had been hull. Water entered with a force that made human strength seem childish. Below, the submarine crew heard the result. But celebration had to remain small. A cheer could wait. Survival could not. Because after the torpedo came the answer. Japanese escorts turned. Their screws grew louder in the headphones. A destroyer or patrol craft did not need to see the submarine perfectly to make life unbearable. It needed only a rough idea, a pattern, a suspicion. Depth charges rolled from racks or fired from throwers, sinking through the water with mechanical indifference. Inside the submarine, men braced. The first explosions could feel distant, then closer, then close enough to make lights flicker and dust fall. Pipes shook. Gauges trembled. A wrench jumped from where it had been placed. Someone cursed under his breath. Someone else checked for leaks. Depth charges did not have to split the hull immediately to terrify. They could loosen fittings, damage instruments, crack nerves. They made the ocean feel personal, as if the water itself had begun hammering on the boat. A man might think of home in that moment. Not dramatically, not with a speech, perhaps only an image. A kitchen, a street, a wife's handwriting, the smell of rain on pavement. Then the next explosion would crush the thought out of him. Above them, Japanese sailors were also fighting to survive. Damage control parties moved through smoke and steam. Men dragged hoses, closed watertight doors, searched for trapped crew. Officers shouted orders over noise that swallowed language. Some ships stayed afloat. Some did not. This is what the phrase shipping loss hides. It hides the seconds after firing. It hides the men below trying not to be found. It hides the men above trying not to drown. It hides the fact that a strategic campaign is made of intimate terror repeated again and again until it becomes statistics. Japan believed its sea lanes could be defended through escort, discipline, and official control of information. But every attack proved something harsher. Even when a submarine missed, the fear remained. Even when a ship survived, schedules changed. Even when newspapers said little, sailors remembered the sound. And as American boats returned from patrol with more claims, more experience, and better weapons, the Japanese escort problem became more desperate. The next stage of the war would not be about one attack. It would be about whether Japan could keep an entire ocean from turning against it. The ocean begins to close. By 1944, the fear had changed shape. It was no longer only the fear of a single torpedo wake. It was the fear of a system being worn down. Convoys could still sail. Escorts could still fight. Japanese sailors could still show courage in conditions most civilians would never see. But the pattern was becoming harder to deny. Ships were missing. Fuel was late. Cargoes were reduced. Routes were altered. The empire still had maps, but the maps no longer carried the same confidence. A line between two ports looked simple until a submarine patrol area cut across it. A convoy schedule looked practical until escorts were unavailable. An air operation looked possible until fuel calculations became too tight. This was the reality newspapers could not easily print. A newspaper can report a battle. It struggles to report a slow collapse of confidence in movement. How do you tell the public that the enemy is not merely attacking ships, but changing the meaning of distance? How do you explain that 1,000 miles of ocean, once treated as imperial space, has become a corridor of uncertainty? The American submarine campaign did not work alone. Aircraft, mines, surface forces, code-breaking, industrial production, and wider Allied pressure all mattered. But submarines struck at something Japan could not replace quickly enough: merchant tonnage and safe passage. Every tanker lost narrowed the future. Fuel shortages did not always announce themselves as disaster. They appeared as decisions. Fewer training flights, reduced fleet movement. Ships held back because the fuel to operate them had to be preserved. Pilots sent into combat with fewer hours than their predecessors had received. Mechanics cannibalizing parts. Commanders saving fuel for moments they hoped would matter, then finding that the moment arrived too late or under conditions they did not control. That is how logistics becomes fate. Not in one speech, in small denials. No, that unit cannot be moved yet. No, that aircraft cannot train today. No, that convoy must wait. No, that garrison will receive less. No, there is not enough. For Japanese troops on isolated islands, the submarine war could feel like abandonment even when no one had chosen abandonment openly. Supplies became uncertain. Reinforcement became rare. Wounded men waited. Ammunition was counted more carefully. Hunger entered places that had once been dots on an operational map. For civilians, the connection was less visible but still present. Rationing tightened. Goods became scarce. Official language asked for endurance. The home front was told to sacrifice for victory, but sacrifice began to feel less like a bridge to success and more like a narrowing room. Meanwhile, American submarines grew more effective. The torpedo problems were addressed. Radar improved. Intelligence support became stronger. Commanders learned where to hunt and how to press attacks. The boats that had once struggled with defective weapons now became increasingly lethal. Japan's anti-submarine effort improved in some areas, but it was fighting from behind. The distances were too large, the demands too many, and the losses too damaging. Escort vessels could not be everywhere. Aircraft could not cover every route. Convoys could not move freely without accepting risk. And risk became expensive. This is where the title's truth lives. The Japanese feared American submarines more than their newspapers admitted because the fear was not only emotional. It was practical. It sat in the paperwork. It affected cargo allocation. It shaped routing decisions. It entered fuel planning. It haunted sailors before departure. The public might not be told the full scale, but the system felt it. A merchant captain could feel it leaving port. A naval officer could feel it reading loss reports. A pilot could feel it when training hours disappeared. A factory could feel it when raw materials did not arrive. A family could feel it when the official explanation no longer matched the emptiness in daily life. The Japanese had believed that control of narrative could preserve national confidence. But what really happened was that submarines attacked the part of war that narrative could not repair. Arrival. The ship either came in or it did not. And more often it did not. The mathematics of fear. War becomes easier to misunderstand when it is reduced to numbers. Tons sunk. Ships lost. Patrols completed. Torpedoes fired. Submarines missing. Cargo capacity destroyed. Fuel deliveries reduced. Numbers can become cold if spoken too quickly. They can sound like accounting. But in the submarine war, the numbers were not separate from fear. They were the shape fear took after it passed through a filing cabinet. A tanker sunk might appear as a line in a report, but that tanker had a route, a crew, a cargo, and a destination. Its oil had already been imagined into future operations. Somewhere, a staff officer had counted on it. Somewhere, a pilot had not yet learned he would never fly the training hours that fuel might have provided. Somewhere, an escort schedule had assumed that shipment would arrive and allow the next movement. When the ship sank, the loss did not end at the waterline. It moved outward. This is what made the submarine campaign so powerful. A submarine was small compared to the fleet it attacked. It carried a limited number of torpedoes. Its crew was tiny beside the thousands aboard major surface forces. But one successful attack could remove thousands of tons from Japan's war economy. The imbalance was brutal. A few men in a submerged boat could force Japan to spend escorts, aircraft, fuel, repairs, replacements, time, and attention. Even an unsuccessful submarine contact could slow movement. Convoys might scatter, reroute, delay, or move under tighter conditions. Fear itself became a cost imposed on every voyage. Japan needed predictability. Submarines created uncertainty. That uncertainty had a mathematics of its own. If ships must wait for escorts, cargo arrives late. If escorts are spread thin, more ships are vulnerable. If fuel is scarce, escorts cannot patrol as aggressively. If aircraft are needed for anti-submarine work, they are not available elsewhere. If shipbuilding cannot replace losses fast enough, every sinking reduces future capacity. The system tightens. Then it tightens again. Post-war assessments would make the scale clearer than wartime newspapers ever could. American submarines destroyed a devastating portion of Japanese merchant shipping. Exact figures vary depending on category and source, and they should be verified carefully before final narration. But the broad truth is not in doubt. The submarine campaign became one of the central reasons Japan's maritime lifeline failed. What matters is not only the number. It is what the number reveals. Japan did not lose merely ships. It lost movement. It lost flexibility. It lost the ability to turn captured resources into sustained power. It lost the confidence that distance could be crossed on command. For an island empire, that is close to fatal. The American cost was also mathematical, and it was severe. The U.S. submarine service represented a small portion of the Navy, yet suffered one of its highest casualty rates. 52 American submarines were lost during the war. Behind each missing boat was a final patrol, a last message, a family waiting, and then silence. That is the other side of the equation. The campaign worked, but it consumed men. It rewarded patience and punished mistakes without mercy. A commander could be brilliant for 9 patrols and die on the 10th. A crew could survive depth charges, mechanical failures, bad weather, and enemy aircraft, only to vanish without explanation. The ocean did not always return evidence. Sometimes the only record was that a boat failed to come home. This is why the submarine war should never be told as a clean story of hunters and victims. It was more complicated. American submariners hunted ships that sustained Japan's war machine. Japanese merchant sailors died in numbers that rarely fit heroic memory. Civilians suffered shortages produced by a war their leaders had chosen and prolonged. Prisoners of war sometimes died aboard ships the attacking submarine did not know were carrying them. Every side carried grief into the water. But strategy does not stop because grief exists. By 1944 and 1945, the arithmetic was becoming impossible for Japan to escape. The empire could still fight, could still kill, could still force terrible costs on the Allies. But its ability to move, supply, train, and recover was being cut apart. The newspapers could keep writing. The numbers kept subtracting. And somewhere in that subtraction, Japanese officers began to understand that the submarine was not merely a weapon beneath the sea. It was a clock, and it was running against them. The men on the ships. A merchant sailor does not usually get remembered like a fighter pilot. He does not stand beside a famous aircraft for photographs. He does not become the face of a battle. He works in the background of war, and if he does his job perfectly, the result is often nothing dramatic at all. The cargo arrives. The ship unloads. The schedule continues. That invisibility becomes cruel when the ship is lost. Japanese merchant crews sailed into danger again and again because the empire required them to. Some were experienced seamen. Some were younger men drawn into a war at sea that offered little glory and enormous risk. They knew, especially later in the war, that the routes were dangerous. They knew ships were disappearing. They knew escorts could not guarantee survival. Still, engines turned. Lines were cast off. Harbors fell behind. A man aboard a tanker might know that his cargo mattered. He might not know where every barrel would go, but he understood enough. Fuel was life for the Navy, the Army, the Air Service, the factories. A tanker crew carried not only oil but expectation. If they reached port, others could act. If they did not, someone elsewhere would be told to make do. The American periscope did not show these men as individuals. That is one of war's merciless simplifications. Through the lens, a ship becomes target angle, mast height, speed, bearing. A commander cannot afford to imagine every sailor on deck. If he does, he may hesitate. If he hesitates, his own crew may die. So the target is reduced. A silhouette, a solution, a firing order. But after the explosion, humanity returns in fragments. Men in the water, flames on oil, shouts in darkness, a lifeboat half lowered, steam screaming from a torn pipe, cargo shifting inside a dying hull. Some Japanese ships carried soldiers. Some carried workers. Some carried cargo that would never reach a battlefield. Some, tragically, carried Allied prisoners or forced laborers under conditions that attacking submarines often could not know. Those sinkings left a bitter shadow over a campaign already filled with hard necessities. The American submariners also paid in ways that did not always appear in victory reports. A successful patrol could end with medals and claims, but the men inside the boat carried memories that did not leave easily. The sound of ships breaking, the sound of depth charges, the knowledge that a target hit in darkness contained men they would never meet. There were no clean hands in such a war. There were only duties, orders, survival, and consequences. A submarine crew returning to base might be greeted with repairs, debriefings, rest if they were lucky, and then another patrol. They could laugh on the tender. They could pose for a photograph. They could paint symbols on a battle flag. But they also knew which boats had not returned. Empty bunks were not abstractions. Missing submarines had friends aboard. For families in America, the submarine war often arrived as uncertainty before grief. A boat overdue. A notice. A hope held too long. The ocean was vast enough to hide the truth permanently. Some crews died in ways no one could reconstruct with certainty. For families in Japan, the losses could be even more obscured. A sailor might simply fail to return. A ship might be reported lost without detail. A death could be absorbed into the larger language of sacrifice. The private grief was real even when the public explanation was controlled. This is the human cost behind the campaign's effectiveness. It is possible to say that American submarines helped break Japan's maritime lifeline. It is also necessary to say that the breaking was done through men drowning, burning, suffocating, waiting, listening, and vanishing. A documentary that forgets this becomes too neat. The war was not neat. It was steel moving through black water toward men who often had only seconds to understand that their lives had changed. It was exhausted submarine crews sitting silently after a depth charge attack, listening for leaks. It was Japanese sailors climbing over twisted metal in darkness. It was officers calculating losses while families learned only pieces of the truth. Japan's newspapers could manage language. They could not manage grief. And as the war turned against Japan, grief became another cargo moving silently through the empire, heavier than anything listed on a manifest. Recognition after the silence. After the war, the paperwork began to catch up with the ocean. Reports were gathered. Claims were checked. Japanese records were examined. Losses were compared, corrected, confirmed, disputed, and counted again. The sea war that had been hidden by distance, censorship, secrecy, and death slowly became visible in tables. The numbers did not have the sound of explosions. They had columns, ship names, dates, tonnage, locations, causes, submarine claims, aircraft claims, mine losses, unknown losses, naval vessels, merchant vessels. It was a different kind of battlefield, assembled after the fact by men trying to understand what had happened across millions of square miles of water. For Japan, the accounting exposed what wartime confidence had concealed. The merchant fleet had been cut down. Tankers had been lost in catastrophic numbers. The ability to move resources from conquest zones to the home islands had been steadily destroyed. The empire that had promised expansion had been trapped by the very sea it needed to command. For the United States, the accounting confirmed the submarine force's importance. The boats had done damage far beyond their size. They had forced Japan to pay for every exposed route. They had hunted warships, tankers, troop transports, freighters, and coastal traffic. They had made the Pacific smaller for Japan and larger for fear. But recognition came unevenly. Some commanders became famous. Names like Dudley Mush Morton of USS Wahoo, Richard O'Kane of USS Tang, Samuel Dealey of USS Harder, and Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb entered submarine history with force. Their stories had drama, aggression, risk, and, in some cases, endings dark enough to resist easy celebration. Yet many crews remained known mostly to families, shipmates, and naval records. A submarine is a collective instrument. A commander gives orders, but the boat survives because many men do their jobs correctly under conditions that allow very little error. The torpedo man, the cook, the sonar operator, the electrician's mate, the machinist, the radio operator, the executive officer each carried part of the patrol. Each lived inside the same pressure hull. Each shared the same risk when the depth charges began. Post-war recognition could not fully reproduce that experience. A medal could honor courage. A citation could record success. A patrol report could describe action. But none of these could recreate the smell of a submarine after weeks at sea, or the feeling of waiting for an explosion that might mean either victory or discovery. For Japan, recognition was more complicated. Admitting the full fear of submarines meant admitting that the empire's leaders had failed to protect the lifeline on which the war depended. It meant acknowledging that the decisive naval struggle had not only been fought in famous battles, but in the destruction of ordinary ships on ordinary routes. That truth did not fit the heroic image of sea power. But war rarely respects the images nations prefer. By 1945, some Japanese officers understood that the submarine threat had become one of the great strategic disasters of the war. Anti-submarine measures had been insufficient, delayed, and overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. The empire had spent enormous energy preparing for decisive battle, but the daily survival of shipping had become a decisive battle of its own. And it was one Japan was losing. The newspapers could not admit this clearly while the war continued. The truth was too damaging, too demoralizing, too close to accusation. But after surrender, when the shouting stopped and the records remained, the conclusion became harder to avoid. The American submarines had not merely frightened Japanese sailors. They had helped make Japan's war plans impossible to sustain. Still, recognition came with silence around the dead. The Japanese merchant sailor whose ship never arrived. The American submariner whose boat never surfaced. The civilians who never knew why shortages deepened. The families who received official words instead of full explanations. The campaign was remembered through tonnage and names, but much of its reality remained underwater. And then there were boats like USS Barb, boats that showed how far the submarine war had evolved by the final year, when American submarines were no longer simply waiting in the sea lanes. They were pushing toward Japan's doorstep. Barb and the war at Japan's door. By the final year of the war, American submarines had become bolder. Not reckless in the childish sense. The ocean punished recklessness too quickly for that. But more aggressive, more confident, more willing to operate in dangerous waters because the balance had changed. Japan's perimeter had contracted. The shipping had been battered. Its defensive system had gaps that could be found and widened. USS Barb, under Commander Eugene Fluckey, became one of the most striking examples of that late war transformation. Barb was not just a submarine hunting distant shipping routes. She became a symbol of how close the underwater war had moved toward Japan itself. Her patrols were aggressive, inventive, and at times almost unbelievable, but they belonged to a real strategic condition. By 1945, American submarines could press into waters that earlier would have seemed far more secure for Japan. The empire had believed distance would protect the home islands. Distance was failing. One of Barb's most famous episodes involved rocket attacks against shore installations and a daring landing party that went ashore to destroy a train. Verify exact location, date, and operational details before recording. It sounds almost like a story invented after the war, but its importance is not simply the drama of the act. Its importance is what it reveals. A submarine had crossed from hidden sea war into direct psychological intrusion. The enemy was not only sinking ships beyond the horizon. He was close enough to strike the coast, close enough to land men, close enough to turn Japan's own territory into a stage for humiliation and alarm. For Japanese leaders, this was more than a tactical embarrassment. It was evidence of a shrinking defensive world. The outer barriers had been broken. The sea routes had been savaged. The home islands were increasingly exposed to air attack, mining, blockade, and submarine pressure. For the submariners, the late war patrols carried a different tension. Success did not make them safe. In some ways, success invited greater risks. A confident submarine commander might press closer to shore, enter shallower waters, attack more heavily defended routes. Mines, aircraft, patrol craft, mechanical failures, all remained threats. The ocean near the enemy's coast was not forgiving just because Japan was losing. Inside Barb, the men were still men inside steel. They still sweated, still listened, still trusted machinery because they had no choice, still knew that a single mistake could turn a famous patrol into a final one. History later remembers boldness. The body in the moment feels fear. This is important. A good documentary must not let success flatten the men who achieved it. Flucky's aggression mattered. Barb's record mattered. But no submarine operated by legend alone. It operated by crew discipline, maintenance, navigation, timing, luck, and the willingness of ordinary men to perform exact tasks while danger pressed around them. The legacy of the American submarine campaign was not only that submarines sank ships. It was that they proved how vulnerable a maritime empire could become when its logistics were attacked relentlessly. They changed how navies thought about sea control. They showed that command of the sea was not only about winning fleet battles. It was also about whether the enemy could move what he needed, when he needed it, across the water he claimed to control. Japan had believed the sea could be defended through decisive naval strength, courage, and imperial will. But what really happened was slower and more destructive. The sea became a ledger, and American submarines kept subtracting. By the time boats like Barb were striking near Japan's own shores, the fear that had once been hidden in convoy reports had become part of the war's final atmosphere. The empire was still dangerous, could still inflict terrible losses, but its freedom of movement had been broken. An island nation can survive many kinds of defeat, but when the ships stop arriving, every other defeat begins to arrive with them. And so the story returns to the same image. A dark sea, a ship underway, a submarine beneath it, and a truth no headline can keep away forever. The truth beneath the headlines. Return to the water. Not the maps. Not the speeches. Not the official announcements. The water. A Japanese ship moves at night with its lights darkened, engines turning, lookouts straining into blackness. Somewhere aboard, a sailor leans against cold metal and tries to stay awake. He may be thinking of home. He may be thinking of nothing. Fatigue does that. Fear does that too. It reduces the world to small things. A cigarette saved for later, the vibration of the deck, the taste of salt, the shape of a shadow that might be only a wave. Below the surface, an American submarine waits. Inside, men speak quietly because loud voices feel wrong in a hunted place. A gauge needle trembles. A hand rests on a valve. Someone checks a stopwatch. Someone listens through headphones, separating the sound of screws from the murmur of the sea. For a moment, everything is still undecided. The ship may pass. The torpedo may miss. The submarine may be found. The men on both sides may live until morning. Then the order is given. This was the war Japanese newspapers could not fully admit. Not because every editor knew every loss, and not because every civilian was prepared to believe the worst, but because the truth itself was too damaging to the story Japan needed to tell about endurance and control. The empire had believed that morale could be protected by language. But war is not finally governed by language. It is governed by fuel, steel, weather, food, training, distance, repair, and the ability to move. It is governed by whether ships arrive. It is governed by whether a pilot has enough gasoline to practice before combat. It is governed by whether an island receives ammunition, whether a factory receives raw material, whether a convoy survives a night crossing. The Japanese feared American submarines more than their newspapers admitted because the fear was practical before it was public. It lived in convoy schedules, in missing arrivals, in escort shortages, in fuel calculations, in the eyes of sailors ordered back onto routes where other ships had vanished. And the Americans, for all their success, did not experience this campaign as clean victory. They experienced it as heat, pressure, faulty torpedoes, depth charges, dead friends, and patrols from which some boats never came home. They learned that the enemy was not a cartoon and the ocean was not a stage. It was a graveyard with no need for witnesses. There is a temptation, after many decades, to make the submarine war simple. Hunters and hunted, victory and defeat, strategy and result. But the truth is heavier. American submarines helped break Japan's maritime lifeline. Japanese sailors died trying to keep that lifeline open. Civilians were told only pieces while the material world around them narrowed. Commanders on both sides made decisions with incomplete information, limited tools, and consequences that spread far beyond the moment of attack. What they believed was that fear could be managed, that losses could be absorbed, that the empires could hold the sea lanes long enough. What really happened was that the sea lanes became the battlefield Japan could not afford to lose. A headline could survive a sinking. A speech could survive a shortage. A slogan could survive a defeat. But a nation at war cannot survive forever on ships that never arrive. And somewhere in the dark Pacific, after the explosion faded and the water closed over steel, the newspaper version of the war became a little harder to believe. Not because someone argued against it, because reality had already answered. If the story reached you, leave a comment with where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served at sea, in the air, on land, or on the home front during the war, share their name if you feel comfortable. These stories survive because people keep telling them carefully. Subscribe to WW2 Warfront for more forgotten stories from the war, not only what they believed but what really happened.